Hi, I'm Paul Anthony. If you're a small shop woodworker like me, you've no doubt used wiping varnish on some of your projects. Wiping varnish is cool stuff because you can use it to create anything from a thin in the wood sort of look for decorative items that don't take a lot of abuse. On the other hand, you can build it up to create a protective and really lustrous finish for tables, chairs, other things like that. In issue 63 of Woodcraft magazine, I wrote an article called Bodybuilding with Wiping Varnish that goes into detail on creating this kind of a finish, which involves a little bit of nuance. Basically, it's a 4-day procedure that begins with day 1, slathering on a coat of thin varnish with a brush and then letting that sit overnight. Day 2, you wet sand and then follow up with a full strength coat of varnish, and then you let that sit overnight. Day 3, you wet sand again, but with a finer grit this time, and you follow up with another full strength coat of varnish. Then you let that sit for a few days to cure, and you come back and you rub it out with 4/0 steel wool, and you follow up by wiping on a thin final coat of the varnish. As for the materials used, we're going to use wiping varnish. In this case, we're using water locks, although other products will work as well. You need mineral spirits for thinning this first coat and also for lubricating when you're wet sanding. You'll want some nitrile gloves to protect your hands. Any old brush will do. You want a clean, soft cotton cloth and some silicon carbide paper, both 400 grit and 600 grit. And finally, you want 4/0 steel wool for your final rub out. Now I'm going to take you through an abbreviated version of this finishing process. Let's start with applying the first thinned coat. All right, now notice that full strength varnish is really rather viscous. As you can see, it slowly drips off of the stick here. Now, what we're going to use here is thinned varnish that we've thinned with about 50% mineral spirits here. And as you can see here, it's a pretty watery mix. That's good. It'll soak into the wood like that then. After stirring it well, we're going to apply the finish onto the workpiece. Now this piece here has actually already been finished. You would normally be applying this to raw wood. Just make sure that you cover all the surfaces thoroughly. Not missing any spots here. Don't worry about brush technique because we're going to be wiping this off in just a few minutes in any case. So after you've coated all your surfaces, you want to just let it sit for a few minutes. In the meantime, reapplying finish to any thirsty areas where it's soaked in. So we're going to let it sit for a few minutes now. All right, now I can feel after a few minutes here that this has started to set up tack. So I'm ready now to wipe this off with a clean, dry cloth. This is an easy matter here. Just make sure that you get into all of the nooks and crannies and get everything wiped down thoroughly. And that's really all there is to it. Just once you've done your entire piece now, just let the whole thing sit overnight and we'll be ready tomorrow for our next coat. All right, so now we've let our first thinned coat dry overnight, and now we're going to wet sand with 400 grit silicon carbide paper to remove any dust nibs or coarseness. Now, I'm going to lubricate the paper with mineral spirits and then just back it with my hand to sand curved surfaces, edges, thin areas like that. You can sand fairly aggressively to remove any coarseness. Now for flat surfaces, use a soft foam block like this, which works much more effectively for broad flat surfaces. Again, lubricate it and then just sand, checking your progress with your hand as you go. You get the idea. When you're done, just wipe the surface clean with a rag to remove any of the sanding slurry. Now we're ready to apply our second coat of finish. All right, now in preparation for applying our second coat, we're going to create an applicator pad from a soft, clean cloth, back folding it like so several times so that we create a sort of rag pad that has a smooth, somewhat convex face for streak-free application. All right, now we're ready to apply our second coat. We're going to dip our rag pad into the finish, just enough to cover the face, and then begin with the edges. Apply just enough pressure to transfer the varnish onto the work without wiping it off. Now in complex areas, conform the pad to the shape of the area, like so, and wipe out. Now the varnish is going to set up a lot faster on this second coat, so work in dedicated areas. Now, such as this entire leg and this entire rail, for example. Now, after you have applied the varnish and it's still liquid, you want to follow up with very light pressure just to even everything out, like so. And finally, inspect it all under reflected light to make sure that you don't have any runs or drips and that everything looks consistent. And when it does, you want to let it set. Don't go back once it's started tacking up and wipe it because you'll create streaks. Now for panels, tabletops and the like, begin as before with your edges. All right, then move to the top. And you want to move relatively swiftly and smoothly, overlapping each previous swath just a little bit. Now notice that I'm swooping in just an inch or so from the end of the panel, and then going back and pulling that out. That's to avoid causing drips by pulling inward against the panel. Make sure you're covering your surface well. And follow up, as before, with light pressure on the rag just to even everything out. Looking at it under reflected light, make sure to do this while the varnish is still very liquid. It's starting to set up tack already here. Once it starts setting up tack, you don't want to revisit it. Work in small sections until you get a feel for the timing. All right. So after you've completed these sections, then scrutinize them under reflected light. When everything looks good, let it set overnight, and we'll put the next coat on tomorrow. All right, so we let our second coat dry overnight, and now we're ready to wet sand again, but this time using 600 grit paper. And just as before, checking our progress by feeling the surface. Once all the nibs and everything are gone and you've worked the entire piece, wipe it clean and dry. Now, we're going to finish up day 3 by applying another coat of full strength varnish in exactly the same way we did as day 2. That is, wiping it on, covering all the surfaces, then leveling them off, carefully inspecting it, and then this time we're going to let the piece sit for at least 3 days. All right, so now we've let our piece sit for at least 3 days for the finish to cure hard enough to rub it out now with 4/0 steel wool. Now the purpose of steel wool is to smooth the surface, removing any dust nibs, and also to take down the high gloss sheen, instead creating a lovely satin luster. Now just make sure to rub all your surfaces carefully and fairly aggressively, paying particular attention to corners and edges and inspecting under reflected light to make sure that you've got a good consistent sheen. Get into corners. Now if you encounter any dust nibs while you're checking with your fingers for smoothness, you find any dust nibs that the steel wool is not taking down, just grab some 600 grit silicon carbide paper, using it dry. Just apply just enough pressure to take down the nib and follow up with steel wool. So just continue on over the whole piece until the whole surface is done, and then finish up by wiping the surface clean of any particles with a clean, soft cloth. All right, so we've rubbed out the entire surface now with 4/0 steel wool, and for the final crowning touch, we're going to apply a thin coat of full-strength wiping varnish, working just small areas at a time because, again, this is going to set up tack pretty fast. And as soon as it does set up tack, you want to use your application rag to vigorously buff the entire surface out. Now what this does is fills in the steel wool scratches and brings the luster back up a notch to a beautiful satin sheen that's also very tough. So there you have it, all the basic steps for creating a beautiful, lustrous wiping varnish finish that's bound to last a good long time. Now that is the basic steps to it. For more application details, talk about wiping varnishes and how to identify them, as well as some beautiful photographs of the type of luster to expect, check out Woodcraft magazine number 63. I'm Paul Anthony. Thanks for watching.